Right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this talk on Dupont's Dirty Dozen. Now, the aims of this talk is to introduce you to Dupont's Dirty Dozen, which is a method of recognizing the main causes of human error, and then apply the Dirty Dozen to skydiving, and then look at what the countermeasures might be to those precursors of human error. And the reason why I thought this was a great talk to do, this is actually, when I was doing my advanced rating, this was my specialist subject, is that I firmly believe that if we can train people to recognise the causes of human error, then we can greatly reduce human error and ultimately make our sport safer. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Kev, and I jump at Chatteris. I'm now a full-time instructor at Chatteris, and the inspiration for this talk was this incident. That how many people in here are also tandem instructors? So you've probably already seen this picture. For those of you that aren't, just take a moment now to see what's wrong with this picture, and pop your hands up if you can see what's wrong with this picture. If you're struggling, look at the student and look at the student's chest strap. Now, I started off, like most people, as a fun jumper, then as a weekend instructor. I got my instructor rating in 2009, teaching static line, and then I became a tandem instructor and then became full-time. And then I moved to Chatteris. Prior to moving to Chatteris, I'd always worked at PTOs where instructors were pretty much given a free rein and let to work on their own and on their own devices. I moved to Chatteris, and the chief instructor there ran a pretty tight ship. And I'd never worked anywhere like Chatteris like that before, where there was such a strong safety culture. So it absolutely amazed me that something like this could happen at Chatteris, where there was this strong safety culture. And particularly to an instructor, I don't know if any of you know who this instructor is, but he was pretty experienced. So how did something like this happen? And it baffled the chief instructor as well. So one of the things that we did following this incident is we actually got a professional aviation training company come in and talk to us about human factors. And one of the human factors that they discussed post this incident was about Dupont's Dirty Dozen. To give you a bit of background on Dupont's Dirty Dozen, Gordon Dupont, who coined the phrase, was a safety examiner for Transport Canada, a bit like the Canadian version of the CAA. And principally, he was looking at safety incidents that were relating to aviation maintenance. The reason why Dupont came up with the 12 incidents was that safety reports that were coming through his desk were all pretty much the same. They all pretty much had the same 12 main causes. The only thing that was different were the dates, the locations, and the names. But the causes of those errors, of those incidents, were all pretty much the same. And he could break them down into 12 main causes. They're not the only 12 main causes. ICAO lists over 300 causes of error. But they are a useful starting point for organisations that, where human errors can result in people getting seriously hurt or killed. They are a useful starting point. And in my research on Dupont's Dirty Dozen, when I was doing my advanced rating, I saw the Dirty Dozen not only relating to aviation safety, but also organisations like the police and the fire brigade, medicine. It's a big thing in medicine, if anybody works in medicine, where human error costs lives. And I thought, well, why don't we relate it to skydiving as well? Because ultimately, we're also in a business where if you make a mistake, it can be, potentially fatal or lead to serious injury. And it's based on the concept that the majority of incidents in skydiving are related to human error. I mean, if you think about it, it's a pilot that flies the plane. It's a human that rigs the equipment, that makes the equipment. It's a human that teaches students, and ultimately our students are human as well, and therefore they're all susceptible to making mistakes. And therefore, if we know that humans are capable of making mistakes, and we look at the precursors to those errors, then those errors are preventable. And we as instructors are actually in a unique position that we sit astride each of those points. We brief the pilots, we teach the students, and we also, we're human ourselves. So we sit astride all of those places where human error occurs. We're also the eyes and ears of our chief instructor to make sure that fun jumpers aren't making those mistakes as well. And so if we train people to recognize the causes of those errors, then we can greatly reduce human errors from actually occurring. So these are the 12 human error, or 12 precursors to human error, Dupont's dirty dozen, if you like. But you can't talk about human error, and you can't talk about Dupont's dirty dozen without talking about the countermeasures. So what the measures we can put in place to stop those errors from occurring. Now, a countermeasure is a recommendation, a regulation, a practice, or a procedure, which, if we put that in place, may break that chain. In the error chain, the Swiss cheese model, it might just move that and stop that error from actually occurring. Now, British Skydiving control recommendations, regulations, and policies. Your chief instructor will control the procedures, but it's up to us to control the practices. What we do controls is a big countermeasure in preventing human error. So the first of Dupont's dirty dozen was the lack of communication, and that's something we've talked about here. Now, I thought it best to try and come up with some examples and case studies to illustrate some of those points. Now, I don't have access to videos like Jeff does, so I did what most people do and looked at that great source of causes of human error, Friday Freakout, and so I've come up with a few case studies here. Is this Dubai? Is it, Scotty? So did you all see that, or were you all looking away? We'll go in slow motion. So what's the main cause of that? What's the human error leading up to a canopy collision? Anybody in the room? Ali. Exit order. That's something that we as instructors need to pay particular attention to, is determining the groups, the exit order, and even wing loading. Other errors that we can find in lack of communication would be student performance. So again, what Jeff was talking about before is how we brief the students, how we talk them down. Also, do we give students too much information when we are briefing them? Do we keep things simple? And the countermeasures to the lack of communication would be to make sure that we never assume that the jumpers on the load know the exit order and the separations, that we discuss these things amongst themselves, that we debrief students effectively, that we make clear communications on the radio when we do the talk down, and that we use effective logbooks and training record cards to make sure that not only are we communicating student performance to the student, but also to other instructors that might be coming along and teaching the students afterwards as well. The second of Dupont's dirty dozen is complacency, which is the point where we reach that self-satisfied feeling that we know it all, that we've been around in this sport for a while. How many people in the room here have less than a year instructing? How many people in the room have less than 5 years instructing? Less than 10 years? More than 10 years? More than 20 years? More than 30 years? More than 40 years? More than 50 years? More than 60 years? Okay. So actually complacency is most likely to occur in those of us that have the greatest competency. So those of us who put our hands up after 10 years, we ourselves are the ones that are most likely to be complacent. And that's where we begin to expect to see what we're intending to see. We're not looking for the dangers. So let's look at a good video of a complacent, or what might be a good illustration of complacency. So the skydive's going really well here. Instructor's smiling. Students smiling, sticking a tongue out. It's going great. Nice. So what went wrong there? Who's brave enough to tell me? Yep, so everything looked great up until pool time. So the instructor got complacent. The other thing went wrong, instructors wearing TVs. Never a good look. So other areas where we fight complacency, flight line checking, pre-flight checks, ground schools and briefs. If you taught the same thing over and over and over and over and again, you know, it's human nature for us to try and make things as efficient as possible, to skip out what we think is not necessary. And that's something that leads to complacency. So the way we can combat that is, of course, always expect the unexpected, but have a routine or system. I personally, when I'm working with students, I do the same thing at the same point, at the same time, at the same height, every single skydive. Of course, key quality of an instructor is to be systematic. And being systematic, following lesson plans, is what's going to save you from complacency. And always use best practice. If you're always following the lesson plan that your chief instructor has given you, if you're always following the ops manual, if you're not taking shortcuts, then you could never, ever be complacent or find yourself complacent. The third of Dupont's precursors to error is a lack of knowledge. And this is a lack of training or experience for the task at hand. It occurs predominantly in professions with constantly advancing technology and changes. Are we in one of those industries? We are. Things constantly change in skydiving. And we need to keep ourselves abreast of each of those changes. Not only that, we also need to guard against the fact that if we don't use information that we've been taught when we were BIs or when we were learning to become instructors, then we're likely to forget a lot of it. So if you don't teach very frequently, you're likely to become, or if you don't jump very frequently, if you perhaps haven't taught an AFF course or a ground school in a long period of time, then you're likely to forget some of the key points. And that's why, coming back to complacency, it's important to follow things like the ops manual and lesson plans. Now, a great case study for a lack of knowledge was the Jeremy Denning incident in 2008. Hands up those of you that are aware of this particular incident. I'm conscious of the fact that some of you work for him. So can anybody tell me what happened in this particular incident? Stacey, come on, what happened? Do you know this incident? Yeah. Tell me what happened.
I was there. You were there. So Jerry was dispatching a static line student, and it was during the competition, so he was keen to get out in a good spot for his accuracy landing, didn't pull the bag in, got hung up. However, nobody realised that Jerry was hung up until DZ Control observed the aircraft coming into land with Jerry trailing behind. Yeah.
Great stuff. So what was the error? What was the error in Jerry's knowledge here? Pulling the bag in. It's disconnecting the bags before you leave the aircraft. So that's the big error in his knowledge. So that's something we all know. How many static line instructors in the room have to disconnect the bags before we get out? We're probably all familiar with that incident as well, so we know that from memory. And yet in 2018, this incident occurred where an instructor was disconnecting the bags after the students got out and before other students got out. So a lack of knowledge occurs at various different stages, and we, again, it's something we need to be mindful of. So errors that can also be caused by a lack of knowledge are not using the approved lesson plans, not being up to date on the ops manual, changes in practices, like how we teach malfunctions, nuisance factors, that was a recent change, and not being aware of safety bulletins. And a countermeasure to this is what the late, great Tom Noonan used to say, is would you bet your rating on knowing absolutely everything that's in your lesson plans, in knowing the ops manual inside out, in knowing the static line, the AFF coaching manual inside and out? Do you know absolutely everything there is to know about being an instructor? And if you don't, that's fine. That's part of being an instructor, is constantly learning. But it's up to you to find out, to fill those gaps in knowledge, to strive to be a better instructor. And that's what this day is all about. It's about CPD, continuous professional development. It's about always striving to be the best instructor that you can possibly be. This day is an example of CPD, of improving yourself, always striving to learn more. But it can be something as simple as sitting in on other people's lectures, other people's ground schools. I learned loads by, when I was doing my advanced course, sitting on people like Ali's courses. That was really enlightening. Another thing that was really enlightening was to be taught myself. A few years ago, I learned to fly. And that was one of the great experiences. I learned loads from actually going back to being that ab initio student and having someone teach me in something that was alien to my sport. Pete Allen talks about, I think it was learning to swim, or becoming a better swimmer, or any kind of sports instruction, being coached in football, rugby, any other sport is great for you as an instructor, because then you can learn about other instructional techniques as well. And if you strive to be the best instructor, then you will avoid having those gaps in your knowledge. Distraction is one of the other key precursors to incidents as well. Dupont reckons that this is responsible for about 15% of all incidents that he saw. And it's based on the principle that our minds work much quicker than our hands. So while we're doing something, our brain's already onto the next task. Now, a classic example of distraction that I got from the SDC minutes was this incident here, where it was found on the aircraft that a tandem instructor on the aeroplane was found with his AAD off. And it was mentioned in the minutes that the instructor was distracted. The reason why the instructor was distracted and the AAD wasn't on was because this particular incident occurred on one of those days where you've been sat around the airfield with absolutely nothing happening. The weather was bad, and then all of a sudden the weather ain't good. And what happens when the weather gets good? Everybody runs around to get their equipment ready. This particular instructor was doing an AFF jump first, and he was back up and doing a tandem jump on the backup lift. Of course, being the diligent AFF instructor, the AFF instructor was paying attention to the student's canopy control. The student's canopy control wasn't fantastic, so he was distracted by the student's canopy control before he then ran in, turned on the AED, but as it turns out, didn't turn on the AED properly, and the person that was flight line checking him was also distracted by the student's poor canopy control. And that's how this particular incident occurred. Now, an incident is probably the biggest distraction that we have as instructors. And so it's important that we as instructors find mechanisms to make sure that we're not distracted by the particular incident at hand, and that we're also looking at what else is happening as well. So if there's an injury, if there's a malfunction, the first thing that happens is everybody's laser focused on the malfunction. Where's the free bag? Where's the main? And they're perhaps not looking at other things. They're not looking at all the other canopies that are in the air, or the canopies that are landing. So it's important that we perhaps pause the lift, ask for help, that we pay attention to what else is going on around us. The other area where we can get distracted is flight line checking. And what do we teach students on B license briefs? If you get distracted on flight line checking, always go back to the start, teaching you to suck eggs with that. Might get disturbed in the middle of a lesson. Student asks a particularly interesting question. Again, we can use lesson plans. Use the lesson plans. Don't be afraid. I mean, a lot of us, I'm just as guilty as the next person, that if you've done a lot of ground schools, where's your lesson plan? How many instructors here have done loads and loads of lessons? Do you still use your lesson plan? Is your lesson plan still there in front of you? Or are you just relying on PowerPoint to get you through? And a lesson plan is a great tool to make sure that you don't get distracted in the middle of a lesson. The fifth precursor to incidents that Dupont talks about is a lack of teamwork. And this is the failure to seek the input of others. It's particularly common in larger organisations. So those of you working for large PTOs, this is more likely to occur. And it's absolutely vital that you work as a team for your safety management systems to be successful. And it calls for trust, a common goal, and communication. Coming back to communication. So here's an incident where there's a lack of teamwork. Back to teams. Friday freak out. So this looks good. Skydive's going well. Whoa. So let's break that down. So it's a bit slower. So this was a boogie in the US, and the breakdown in teamwork here was that the two pilots weren't talking together. That helicopter was actually taking skydivers up. And so there was a breakdown, DZ control, and the two pilots. They weren't working effectively. So the countermeasures to a general lack of teamwork is to be approachable. So teamwork is a symptom, or a lack of teamwork is a symptom of a poor culture. And if you find that you're not working as a team, then the issue might be with your organisation itself. One thing I got from a TED talk is that you should always endeavour to be the zero in your organisation. Now, in organisations, there's zeros, there's minus ones, and there's plus ones. So a minus one is usually someone that's new. And the reason why they're a minus one is because they're taking capacity away from someone else in the organisation to train them. The person training them is a plus one, because not only are they training that other person to do the task, but they're also doing their own job at the same time. So they're a zero and they're a plus one because they're doing something else. And what you should always strive to be is you should always strive to be the zero. You should always just get on with your job. And if you can possibly help someone else in their job, you should be the plus one as well. So always seek opportunities to help and work through problems. Work through problems together. And while you're packing, if you can possibly have a Cocker Spaniel and someone playing a guitar helping you, then it also helps with teamwork as well. The sixth cause of error Dupont identified was fatigue, which is a loss of awareness caused by tiredness. And fatigue is a major contributor to human error. It's insidious. It's insidious. We don't always notice that it's happening. It rarely works alone. You can often find it in conjunction with other factors. As an organisation, we always tend to underestimate how tired people can be. And as individuals, we always tend to overestimate what we can deal with. So let's look at a Friday freak out for an instance of fatigue. So I think this is South Africa. Whoop. So the students pulled the cutaway pad there before he's pulled what looked like a reserve ripcord. And I use this particular incident to illustrate fatigue because it reminds me of an incident that I saw at my particular PTO with my ex-girlfriend. We should never talk about exes. But she was learning to skydive. She was on a level 5. Again, it was one of those days where it wasn't quite jumpable for students. The winds were over the limits, and then at the end of the day, the winds came under the limits, and she could jump. But we as instructors tend to underestimate just how tiring it can be to sit around a drop zone when you are nervous. When you are nervous, you probably haven't slept the night before. I'm still constantly reminded of this when I don't with tandem students, and the number of tandem students that I take that haven't slept the night before the jump. And it's the same with AFF students as well. When I was on my AFF with Scotty in Spain, day 2, day 3, I didn't sleep a wink on those nights. So just being a student is tiring. Sitting around the airfield is tiring while we build, all that nervous energy is building up and building up and building up, and then at the end of the day, the winds are finally below the limits. We've got to go jump. I'm absolutely knackered. So fatigue is something that we always have to be mindful of as instructors. We need to be mindful of the fact that we don't overestimate what our students are capable of, or what we're capable of as well. Also, we need to be careful of Met Roulette, of these kind of activities. Many, many years ago, I learned that I could no longer, as I used to, as a fun jumper, be up all night doing this type of thing and then jump the next day. And it's something that we as instructors need to be aware of, but it's also something that we need to make the students aware of as well, is that this greatly affects performance, as well as other nighttime activities that go on at PTOs. Too much bed, not enough sleep, an expression. So we need to be aware of the symptoms of fatigue and look for them not only in our students, but also in ourselves. One of the other main causes of fatigue for instructors is not eating properly. When you're on one of those days when you're doing ground school all day, or when you're jumping, you're doing 10, 11, 12 jumps, 14,000 feet, 15,000 feet, a lot of the time, it takes it out of you. Particularly if you're not hydrated and if you're not eating properly. It's very, very easy when you're doing 10 jumps a day, packing in between, or if you're teaching, to not look after yourself and not eat. I don't know about your PTO, but our canteen is absolutely rammed. We quite often have 80 tandem students all in the canteen. It can be a nightmare to actually get something to eat. And it can be a real struggle. You've just stepped out for a couple of minutes. Your students are on a 15-minute break, and there's a 15-minute queue in your canteen. One of the real casualties following COVID at our PTO was that we reduced the number of staff members that we had in the canteen. I don't know if it's the same at your PTO. But it's a real struggle to get something to eat. My boss's solution to this, Gary Small, is Gary Small's legendary lunchbox. I haven't had a lunchbox since I was at school, but it's something I now have to do to make sure. I have to force myself to have something to eat during the day and to take a drink with me as well, because fatigue is a major player, not only in students, but also in instructors. Another thing that greatly helps you with fatigue as well is to exercise regularly. And this is another thing that can be tough, particularly as a full-time instructor, or if you've got a full-time job and then you're instructing at weekends, is finding time to exercise, because exercise is a great preventer of fatigue during the day. Now, a lack of resources was Dupont's number 7. And this is really common when things get tough. It's a lack of material support, because resources are often safety nets and help to prevent incidents. There's a horrific case study here of a tandem incident that occurred in Poland on an advanced rig. And what had happened, I mean, this is all in Polish, there's no point seeing it, was that they'd actually used a flex pin made out of the incorrect material. because it was cheaper than the flex pin that Advanced supply. What had happened when that flex pin was under load was that, if you can see from the picture at the bottom there, that it had actually stripped the Teflon coating on the flex pin, and the flex pin stayed in place. And horrifically, you can see from the picture on the right-hand side as you look at it what the outcome was. But a lack of resources doesn't just refer to material goods; it also refers to staffing as well. I don't know if it was the same at your PTO, but 2 years ago, in a post-COVID world, it became really difficult to get instructors. I don't know if it was just because instructors weren't doing courses and weren't coming through, and that had put a tremendous load on the instructors that were at the PTOs. So a lack of resources refers not only to equipment, but also to people as well. So the obvious countermeasures to this are to network, make friends, and discuss at events like this, staffing levels, and would you be interested in coming work at our PTO for a weekend? With equipment, one thing that Noel's very hot on at Hibblestow is he has this saying that no rig has the right to be in the air. If you see a problem with equipment, don't be afraid to ground it or refer it to a rigger and take it out of service. The eighth precursor to incidents that Dupont identified was pressure. And this is ever present in our industry where time is money. And there's no greater pressure than having that aircraft sat on the ground with Chris McCann telling you, come on, hurry up, you've got to get on board the aeroplane. Now, pressure can be self-inflicted. That aeroplane sat outside waiting for you to get on it is a massive, massive motivation, a cause of pressure for you to get on board the aeroplane. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you should rush packing your equipment to get on it, or that you should be running to the flight line with your altimeter in a helmet, hopefully, with your goggles in the helmet, hopefully, and not on the flight line. So pressure is often self-inflicted. And it's critical that we as instructors learn to identify and deal with the pressure. So again, another horrific case study was the case of a double fatality that occurred in Australia in 2017. Now I was fortunate enough to be at the CPD day where they actually spoke about this and showed video, and it's not for public consumption, probably quite rightly. But what occurred in this particular incident was that there was a very experienced tandem instructor on board the aircraft, and he dropped his handycam. And he couldn't get his handycam off the floor. So he disconnected his disconnected his student so he could reach the handycam. As he reached down to get the handycam, he knocked the drogue out of the container. So what would most sensible people do in that particular incident? Ride the aircraft down. But oh no, not this guy. He actually picked the drogue back up, tried to fit it back in, tried to reconnect the student. In the process of reconnecting the student, he somehow managed to get the drogue attached underneath the top hooks, because he was under pressure, or definitely self-induced pressure to jump, because he felt that perhaps the DZO would think badly of him because he hadn't jumped. It's crazy when you think about it. A very experienced instructor, and horrifically, they both died. So pressure creates rushing, and rushing creates incidents. So we should never be tempted to do in-aircraft or in-air rigging. We should never be tempted to rush to meet the aircraft, rush our pack jobs, rush our briefs even. A first free-fall brief. How many people, static line instructors, have been given 20 minutes to do a first free-fall brief because you're on the next lift? No. It takes at least, well, for me, it takes at least an hour to do a first free-fall brief. So be aware that pressure is something that you can say no to. If you feel like you are being pressured, communicate your concerns to senior instructors, your chief instructor, ask for extra time. Don't be afraid to ask for extra time to do a brief, and know when to say no or stand by. Most importantly as well, make sure that pressure isn't self-induced, that you yourself aren't putting yourself under pressure to meet the aircraft, when perhaps you could just get on the next aeroplane. Number 9 in Dupont's precursors to error is a lack of assertiveness, which is ultimately failing to speak up when something doesn't look right. Assertiveness isn't about you speaking up, it's also about making yourself approachable so that people can speak to you if they don't think something's right with things that you are doing. And it's the middle ground between being passive and aggressive. Again, feeling that you can't speak up is a symptom of poor culture in your organisation. So a lack of assertiveness, I've spoken of other people, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about an incident that relates to myself, where I lacked assertiveness. This is a 2-out that happened at a PTO that will remain nameless. And the reason why this 2-out happened is because I had seen this rig on numerous occasions, and I'd thought that the excess in the reserve handle looked too short. And I'd mentioned it to the rigger, and the rigger had said, "Nah, it's fine, Kev. You know, there's plenty of excess." And sure enough, here comes Billy. Billy's 6'2", rugby player. We extend the harness for him, and then wonder why there's a 2-out on a slightly hard opening. That was my fault. I should have been more assertive, and I should have said, no, this excess is too short, and it's likely to cause an incident. So if you have any equipment or performance concerns, it's up to you to stand up. It was mentioned in Jeff's part of the talk that over-progression is another area where we need to be bold and say no. The incident with the student having the 2-out and the instructor having a 2-out, was that an example of over-progression? I certainly, looking at that video, that's my first thought. That was over-progression. That student, A, perhaps shouldn't have been on that level, and B, should the instructor have let them go? Was that a lack of assertiveness? And of course, the other thing that's really prescient in these days is if you have safeguarding or GDPR concerns. It was really, really alarming to hear from Nicola that we're having incidents now where students and fun jumpers are making complaints against the behaviour instructors. Whose fault is that? That's ours. Because it's our responsibility that if you see an instructor behaving inappropriately, to go and speak to that instructor. It shouldn't get as far as a safeguarding concern. I started jumping in 2001. I became an instructor in 2009. Even in the days of 2009, it wasn't unusual. I used to work with a guy that used to ask students out under canopy. I used to work with another guy who used to get the details of people from their training record cards so he could ask them out. It's horrific. Everybody's shaking their head, and quite rightly so. But if we're all shaking our heads, why aren't we speaking to these instructors and telling them that it's completely unacceptable before it gets to the point? These incidents don't occur in a vacuum. We know this type of behaviour is going on by certain instructors, and it's up to us to stop that kind of behaviour before we even take it to our safeguarding lead. So stand up for yourself and understand it's your responsibility to make these calls, to speak to the people that are involved. And if you think that you can't, find a common go-between. If your chief instructor, occupies such a position that it's difficult to speak to them, then why not speak to a senior instructor that you feel you can talk to and that can talk to the chief instructor on your behalf in such an incident. But also, if people are feeling that it's difficult to stand up for themselves, then look at your own culture and look at yourself. Are you unapproachable? Is your organisation unapproachable? And is that something that you as an organisation perhaps need to change? Stress is number 10 on Dupont's Dirty Dozen checklist. Now, stress can be a good thing, but it can also be a negative thing. Stress inspires us to perform well, but it can also take over our lives and manage us as well. And stress can be a number of different factors that can be internal to skydiving, or they can be external to skydiving as well. One case study that I relate to with this was that I was dispatching students one day out of a 182. And it was a busy day, lots of students to dispatch, so I stayed on board. We came in to land in the aeroplane, and it's an airfield where there was a tarmac strip that was part of a bigger grass strip. And as we came to land on the tarmac strip, the pilot landed with one wheel just off the tarmac strip on the grass strip, and we span around on the airfield, but luckily no one was hurt, no aircraft was damaged. And I turned around and I gave that look to the pilot, and he said to me, "Kev, I'm really, really sorry." He was going through a divorce at the time. The divorce was weighing heavily on his mind, and he wasn't concentrating. The stress was detracting from what he was doing. Now, it's sometimes difficult to recognize that we are under stress. And you can use things, basic checklists, to look at yourself, whether you're stressed. It's another thing I got from a TED talk, is that you can do a halt check on yourself. So some of the 4 main causes of stress are that you might be hungry, you might be angry, you might have had a fallout with your instructor, you might have relationship problems, or you might be tired, talking about fatigue. These are the 4 main causes. So you can do what's called a halt check on yourself. Use it as a self-assessment to see if you are under stress. You can also use the bucket method. You know, we all have a bucket of stress that we can absorb. And when that bucket's full, we need to find ways of either making sure that we don't add any more to the bucket, or that we take stuff out of the bucket. So we discuss resolutions. Other strategies might be to ask for help, or just take a lesson off or a lift off. If you're teaching and you're getting tired, guess how your students are feeling as well. It might be tough for them. So taking a lesson off, getting someone else to teach is great for you. You get a lesson off, but it's even better for your students because they get a fresh face to take them through. Number 11 on Dupont's list is a lack of awareness. So we've got alertness or vigilance that's lacking. And this occurs just as likely in the experienced as the less experienced. And it's a failure to anticipate what might possibly happen in those particular instances. So it's basically looking at something and going, what could possibly go wrong? Is this a good idea? So is this a good idea? I don't know. Might be. Is this a good idea? Anybody still doing this? Some nervous looks. The canopy sizing chart. Are we all jumping canopies that are appropriate to what we should be doing? So some of the countermeasures to this might be to anticipate what might occur in the event of an accident. Ask others. I've got this great big tandem pole here. I think it's a great idea. Do you think this is a good idea? Where I've got this camera mounted on my helmet, do you think that's a good idea? But make yourself aware that what you're doing might be a problem. And it's likely that if you're doing something, that if you've got a lack of awareness of what might possibly be going wrong, other people have noticed it. So always seek the opinion of other people. And finally, we come to norms. And we go full circle with this. Now, norms are, again, what Nicola was alluding to at the end of what she was saying. These are the unwritten rules or practices that are followed or tolerated by everything. Basically, this is the way things are done at this PTO. They can be positive and they can be negative. So the safety culture at Chatteris, when I first got there, was just a norm. You know, and that's positive. However, that positivity led to complacency at Chatteris. So one of the reasons why I believe this incident occurred was because we had this really positive attitude towards safety at Chatteris. The chief instructor had played a really tight ship. However, one of the things that also occurred at Chatteris was because we had all these safety protocols in place, that some of the instructors felt that some of the rules didn't apply to them. And one of the rules that didn't apply to the instructors at Chatteris was doing basic things like handles checks. One of the instructors, I used to film tandems as well as jump tandems at Chatteris, and I noticed that one of the instructors wasn't doing his handle checks in freefall, and I said to him, why aren't you doing your handle checks in freefall? I do 800 jumps a year, Kev. I know where my handles are. Why aren't you checking your student on the ground, which is the obvious place you would have spotted this? Or why are you doing a check in the aircraft, which is another place you would have spotted this? I've already checked the student on the flight line, Kev. You know, what are they going to do? Take their chest strap off before they get on board the plane? That's exactly what happened in this particular incident. This student had been kitted up. They'd gone off, done a lift. She was on the backup lift. And in between the first lift and the second lift, she'd gone to the toilet, taken the harness off herself, put the harness back on, but the chest strap was threaded behind her. So that's how this occurred. For those of you that are interested, she did jump in this configuration, and she did make it. But it was very, very close. And this was a direct result of the norm that we're super safe at Chatteris. Some of the rules don't apply to us. And that's obviously changed now. So be aware that just because it's the norm at your PTO doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. So refuse to take part in what you see are negative norms. Always, always, always follow best practice and British skydiving procedures and the ops manual. If you're following the ops manual, no one can ever criticize you for anything that goes wrong. Errors occur. Sometimes we forget to do things. Sometimes we're tired. But if you're following the ops manual, if you're following procedures, if you're following best practice, you can't be criticized for what's happened. So in summary then, I would propose that most errors are caused by human error, and therefore they're preventable, particularly if we train ourselves to look at what are the main causes of human error. The Dirty Dozen isn't an exhaustive list of what causes human error, but it does give us a great starting point to look at what the causes are, and therefore in ourselves we can look at what strategies we can put in place to recognize these 12 main causes to prevent errors occurring both ourselves and in our students. Learn from the mistakes of others. Read STC minutes. Take CPD. So always strive to be the best instructor you can possibly be. CPD can be something as simple as reading STC minutes, learning the mistakes of others, or learning a new skill. And consider maybe getting some human factors training for your PTO. Broaden your horizons and look at what things are happening in the aviation world to reduce error, or what are happening in other sports as well. And that's the end. Has anybody got any questions or really good examples of things that perhaps I've missed? Yeah. Crew resource management. Good point, thank you. So crew resource management is a part of human factors, which is the way aviation's, what's the best way of describing it? Aviation's SMS, if you like. No, he's not. Yeah. Yeah. Hang on, Will. Can I just give you this. So Will's asking, while I get the microphone across, is how much human factors analysis actually goes into looking at the incidents that occur in skydiving. And I think it's a good point. Sorry, go on.
The example you had on the screen had the text where it said and it had AirTech analysis. The AAD hadn't been turned on, and it said the blame lies clearly with name redacted tandem instructor, but you picked out all the golden bits because you can look at a case study and go, that human made a mistake. I won't make that mistake, but you will because you're a human. The really golden bits are the bit you picked out about, well, the weather and the pre-jump checks had been done in a rush, and maybe there's a procedure that could be put into SOPs there, or the talk down that the instructor was doing, which staffing or organisation, and those bits don't tend to appear in the stuff that we get to see from BS. It's this happened and this was the person and this is the mistake or the error that they made.
I agree, and it's a shame Jeff's not here. And Jeff said that he would pop in later just in case there's any difficult questions like that from Will. But I completely agree. I personally don't see it in the way that we investigate. But I'm not British Skydiving. I'm an instructor examiner, and I'm an instructor. I see what you see. I see the minutes. And there seems to be in the minutes details that are not there. I can't speak for British Skydiving. I would like to see, like you, more analysis of the human factors that might be leading up. Yeah, it does. Yeah. John.
I think Will's raised a really good point there, and we're actually doing something about that. And one of our problems is that we can do human factors analysis on incidents that get reported to us, but most minor incidences, which are near misses, never get reported at all, do they? And that's a huge area of information that we're missing out on. And you may or may not know that, well, you probably do know because you're a pilot, aren't you? In aviation, you've got CHIRP, which is Confidential Human Factors Incident Reporting Programme, whereby people can report any worries or concerns to a charity which is outside the regulatory bodies, and they analyse the incidents using exactly Dupont's Dirty Dozen and various other ways of doing it. And at the moment it's for general aviation, but probably from the end of March or the beginning of April it will be open to skydivers to report incidents to, and you're never identified publicly if you report an incident to it, and this will be open to any skydiver, even non-skydivers on the drop zone who see a problem can report it. And there's a regular meeting where they analyse incidents into those categories and then publicly publish it on the net and in print, but without the drop zone or the people involved being identified.
Yeah, I agree, and I think a large part of training for instructors would be to learn from others' mistakes, but go into, as Will says, the detail of what were the factors that led up to that particular mistake. I mean, the Jeremy Denning incident, if you're interested, there's a whole TV documentary, several TV documentaries probably, regarding that particular incident, and it's really interesting to see that, and it's interesting to go into a lot more depth about incidents, and I think we'd learn a lot. I mean, Hank Post, I used to have it in this one, but it's a tandem incident, so perhaps not relevant. He talks about an incident where he was complacent, where he did the wrong drill. So do go back on YouTube and look up that, because it's a really good process where Hank talks about what were the stages that led up to that particular incident, and what were the major causes of that incident. And I think we need more of it to try and learn from it.
I just had it's probably more of a comment really than a question, but in the previous presentation when we were talking about that issue with the landing and the back injury from a landing and the talk down, it was sort of interesting that we were encouraged to talk about, or encouraged to do better talk downs, when actually that wasn't the root cause of the issue at all. That was just an incidental thing that happened as part of the whole process. But I think it sort of underlines the point around actually talking about and understanding what the actual issue is and not just what the outcome was. And I think that as an organisation, if we can have better understanding of the root cause analysis of incidences, we can then actually put the plans in place to prevent the incidences and not just deal with the fact that we've got a claim around a back injury that was in some way related or told to us to be related to a talk down, when really we're solving the wrong problem there.
Yeah, I agree. And how many of them made the point, if the person wanted them to tell them when to flare, should they have been jumping? You know, that's a good point. Any other points? If not, we're at the time. Oh, here's Jeff. Jeff, very good. Okay, never mind. We'll talk to you afterwards. A good question came up, but we've got to move on to the next step. So we'll maybe give Noah 5 minutes to set up, and then we'll be back in here, and Noah Watts from UPT's the next person.